All right. Thanks, everyone. My name is Ashley Cates, and welcome to AIA Tennessee's informational session on the single stair legislation. I'm the Executive Vice President of AIA Tennessee, and we appreciate you taking the time to learn more about this subject matter. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items to ensure the meeting runs smoothly. Please try to mute your microphones to keep them muted unless anyone is speaking. Helps to minimize the background noise and ensures everyone can hear. So if you have any questions, please use the chat function and we will address those questions during the designated Q&A session. Also, this meeting is being recorded for those who cannot attend. If you have any technical issues, please either send a chat, a private message to Molly Craig, and she can help you work things out. And then lastly, for AIA members, please make sure you put your name and your AIA number into the chat. That way we can report your attendance to AIA National. Thanks for your cooperation. And this time I'm going to turn it over to AIA Tennessee's president, Matt Lau.
Thanks, Ashley. And yeah, like Ashley said, make sure you put that number in there so we can get credit. This is a really exciting presentation. I think what we're going to be talking about today is something that has changed in the state of Tennessee, that I think we're sort of on the leading edge of the country for seeing this movement of reform. And we have an incredible panel of people who are going to speak to this today from all around the country. I don't think we're here to sort of make necessarily direct recommendations for what happens in your local communities, but we want to equip our members with all. Oh, you can go back a slide real quick, Ashley. With all the knowledge that we're going to need as we see this start to roll out locally. So our agenda for today, I'm going to give a brief introduction of our guests. We're going to do an overview of what single stair is. Then we'll discuss some other municipalities that have implemented this. Then we're going to look at what has been updated at the state's Tennessee Code annotated level. Then we'll talk about what our next steps and what resources are going to be available for AIA Tennessee members and local authorities having jurisdictions and city council members and zoning and planning and all the folks that we're going to be having these conversations downstream over the next year or so. And then at the end, we'd love to leave time for some question and answers, because I know that there's probably plenty of people who have questions and answers. We have a really broad range of people who are in attendance on this call today. I think we are really excited to see that. And yeah, at this time, I'd like to just give everybody a brief introduction of our guests. So Mark Chubb is a fire safety engineer who's based out of Seattle, Washington. Over a career spanning more than 4 decades, Mark has worked as a code official, a code developer, a code consultant in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. His experience includes work on 5 continents with both prescriptive and performance-based codes and standards. Mark serves on the AIA Seattle Board of Directors and the chapter's Professional Practice Committee. He's a former co-chair of the chapter's Codes Committee and a frequent presenter for chapter educational programs. Mark formerly served as the chairman of the technical director of the Institute of Fire Engineers and is an active member of the Society of Fire Protection Engineers. He holds a research faculty appointment in the Christian Regenhard Center for Emergency Response Studies and the John Jay College of Criminal Justice at the City University of New York. He previously held faculty appointments in Portland State University School of Government and the Master of Science in Emergency Management program at the John Jay College. And Casey Alexander is an architect at SAR Plus Architects. She earned a Master's of Architecture from UC Berkeley and has experience on diverse project types, including multifamily residences, mixed-use offices, schools, and retail spaces. She's committed to collaborating with her team to advocate for building code reforms to increase diversity of housing options in cities, particularly those that are related to the single-stair housing that we're talking about today. Sean Jersnick is the co-founder of AIA Colorado's Housing Committee and a housing advocate. And this year he moderated a panel on single-stair reform at the AIA 24 conference in DC, which I actually got to go to that panel. It was a fabulous, fascinating discussion. And Sean won a research grant to organize the National Stair Design Competition, which we'll hear about later on today. Tricia Stuth, as some of you know, is an architect and a professor in the School of Architecture at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. She's also a founding partner of Curve, an architectural design practice, which is located in Knoxville, Tennessee. Her work has been recognized with national, regional, and state AIA design awards, including an AIA Committee on the Environment Top 10 Green Award. Tricia is a recipient of the AIA Young Architects Award, 2 ACSA AIA Housing Design Education Awards, the ACSA AIAS New Faculty Teaching Award, ACSA Design Build Award, and an NCARB prize for the creative integration of teaching and practice. Tricia lectures widely to academic and professional circles and shares her research and practice through publication. A leader in housing design education, she structures community, government, and professional partnerships to encourage future architects to be advocates in their own communities. And as a former student of Tricia's, I can say that she's doing a great job at that. And with that, I think I'd like to turn it over to Sean.
Thanks, Matt. I appreciate the introduction. Great to see you again. I'm excited to be here today, talking to everyone about single stair and code reform. It's a really exciting topic. Casey and I work at SAR Architects in Denver, a firm that primarily does multifamily housing. And we got into this single stair topic because even though it may seem like a simple topic at first, which we'll get into, the concept really cuts across a lot of the issues that we have to deal with in multifamily housing today, and a lot of the struggles and challenges that multifamily projects deal with today as architects. And single stair housing offers another housing type and another housing option, like another tool we can add to our belt for design and development. So it's really exciting to talk about it. Next slide, please. So just to step back and start with a definition on single stair. It's often referred to as point access block housing or vertical shared egress. It's really the most common type of multifamily housing across the globe and historically across the world. And for a lot of reasons, the building code and built environment evolved in the US on a different course than the rest of the globe over the last 100 years. But it's a very powerful type of housing that offers a lot of options and is very versatile. And essentially, single stair housing is a floor plan or building that has units clustered around a central circulation core. It's often a stair combined with an elevator. It's usually in new projects in the US where it's being built. It's often the combination of stair and elevator, and not a walk-up, but walk-ups are also common and they're not unusual. And it's a floor plan that's really dense and compact and efficient. And that's all it really is. So next I'll dive into more details on it and kind of our housing options today that we have. So next slide, please. So right now in the US, in most jurisdictions, if you're using the base IBC code, you just have a few basic building blocks that you can work with. If you're building at a height of 3 stories or lower, you can build with single stair. And the IBC limits those projects to 4 units per floor clustered around the central stair. So it's something that we're already building and is common across the US today. Those projects often fit on small sites, have small footprints, but if you want to build taller than 3 stories, the IBC requires that you have 2 means of egress. And so for taller projects, the floor plate needs to increase in size to accommodate multiple stair cores and a corridor that connects the two. And that results in either a single loaded corridor, which has a pretty inefficient floor plate as far as the net leasable area that you're building, when compared to a double loaded corridor, which is more common when building in the US today. When you're building above 3 stories, you usually see 2 stair cores with a corridor slicing through the middle and units on either side of that. And that building has a much wider footprint than the small single stair footprint that you see on the left. So the options, the sites of where you can build are very different based on the height that you're building on, regardless of how your site is zoned. For example, Denver's full of lots of narrow lots in our central downtown area, 30 or 40 foot wide lots that are zoned for heights up to 8 or 10 stories. They're along transit corridors. The city is envisioning that they'll grow and hoping that they'll grow and add density, but because they're small lots, it's impossible to add height to those lots because you'd need to add 2 stair cores, a corridor connecting them, and suddenly this small lot becomes extremely inefficient to build, and all the numbers on a project like that fall apart. So if you're able to build taller with single stair, suddenly the development opportunities start to get unlocked in areas where growth is already being encouraged in the city. Next slide, please. So when you look at multifamily housing development in the rest of the world and floor plans in the rest of the world, double loaded corridors are actually very uncommon unless you're building dormitories or hotels. The more common floor plan in other countries is what you'll see on the left here, is units clustered around a circulation core and units that have aspects that have access to daylight and views on multiple sides, that units that can cross ventilate, units that don't have extreme depths where parts of the unit don't see any daylight. You'll see compact floor plans and a series of these like single stair modules ganged up together when you have larger multifamily projects. In contrast, in the US, we use the wider double loaded corridor floor plan that you see on the right. And one thing that's interesting to point out when looking at these 2 diagrams of floor plates next to each other, both these floor plans provide an equal number of bedrooms. So the project on the left, in addition to providing a great number of bedrooms, can also now provide more green space on the lot when compared to building a wide double-loaded corridor building. So the project on the left, the units that span full depth will put their active spaces, their living rooms, on the street side, and then put their bedrooms on the courtyard facing side. So units can open windows at night, cross ventilate the unit as you sleep, and then bedrooms facing the courtyard just have a quiet evening's sleep, in contrast to a double loaded corridor that you see on the right, where half the units always face the street and they're not able to cross ventilate, and there's no respite from the activity and noise of being on the street. Next slide, please. So in the US, we actually have a long history of building with single stair construction. This summer, there was a great article in the Architectural Record that discussed single stair point access block construction. And that article featured this floor plan and these photos from a project in Queens and New York City that was written about in Arch Record in the 1920s. And this project was celebrated for its variety of open spaces, its units that had great daylight and then could all be cross-ventilated. And this project, if it was built in most cities today, couldn't be built like this because it essentially is two point access blocks that are ganged together. And so there's two stairs you can see in the photo on the right, the two entries that residents would use to access the building and then walk up to their units. And then each unit had a side that faced the street and then a side that faced a small interior courtyard. So it's something that, you know, the US has done before and several cities have been doing for a long time, but it's uncommon today. Next slide, please. So when looking at urban development patterns and urban areas across the globe, this is a common development theme that you'll see, is that most multifamily development will use a series of single stair buildings with narrow floor plans that wrap an entire block. And this creates a quiet central courtyard. And you can see it in this photo from Copenhagen. If you look at the roofs are broken up on each block, and each of those separate roofs is a separate single stair structure, a structure that's 5 or 6 stories in height, and that's accessed via a single stair. And so this development pattern adds a lot of density to this neighborhood, creates a lot of activity, creates a lot of entries along the street and opportunities to include ground floor retail because of the density. And it's a much different pattern than what we see in common development in the US when you're developing an entire block. Next slide, please. This is more common today, what we see in the US with apartments filling an entire block that have wider floor plates where units can't span the entire depth of the floor plate because a corridor is required to run the length of the building to provide access to the different means of egress. And then these types of buildings have less open space in the middle if they have access to open space or courtyards. They also will gang the entries or the egress points. There'll be overall less egress points than you would see with a single stair development pattern. And you'd have fewer exits and you'd have more people using each exit. So you may have 100 units on one floor that share 2 or 3 stairs instead of the traditional development pattern of the previous slide from Copenhagen, where you might see 15 or 20 units total sharing a single stair. So it's a much different approach to development, but also as far as the egress strategies, it's much different as far as the volume of residents that are using each means of egress. And it is a very different animal. Next slide, please. So the housing type that I was showing in Copenhagen, and that's really common around the world, is really a housing type that's missing from development options in the US today. And so it's really part of the missing middle housing conversation when we're looking for housing solutions in the US today and experiencing the housing crisis. We're really limited on missing middle housing types that are bigger than detached housing, single family homes, and housing that's smaller than high rises or 5/1 apartments. You really see a big gap in the housing that's being built in between those scales. In the US, it's really uncommon to see apartments that are 15 or 20 units, even though once you get out of the US, most countries around the world, it's very common to see projects of that scale. Next slide, please. And another reason that it starts to make sense is when you unlock density options on a site, options for increasing density on a small lot, you're suddenly decreasing the development cost per unit. So a few cities in the US, like Seattle and New York City, allow single stair projects with certain safety provisions to be built up to 6 stories in height. And so these projects can be built on very small lots at twice the density of what they could be built with in other cities or outside of those city borders. So those projects now, instead of developing a 12-unit project on a small lot, it's possible to develop a 20 or 24-unit project on a small lot. And so that really makes smaller sites more viable in the city, and it reduces the construction cost per unit and creates a less costly unit that you're building if you're adding density on small lots. Next slide, please. So just to reiterate a few of these benefits that I've been talking about of single stair buildings, they make smaller sites more viable by allowing for a missing middle housing type that doesn't exist right now. The unit types, the units themselves, improve access to daylight and ventilation. And then the dense development on small lots creates more walkable neighborhoods. Once you're adding density to areas where development is already being encouraged, you're supporting transit networks, you're supporting opportunities for street level retail, and you're developing with a finer level of development instead of common development patterns where multiple lots would need to be bought up and combined and assembled to build a tall, dense development. You're creating infill opportunities on underutilized lots that don't exist right now. So that's why where single stair is allowed, that it's been successful, because developers have seen these opportunities and used single stair to build these kinds of great projects. Next slide, please. So when comparing the US to the rest of the world, I've mentioned the building code outside the US. This is a chart that shows the single stair height restrictions in other countries. And the US is kind of down at the bottom of the chart. Canada actually is more restrictive in that the maximum height allowed in Canada is 2 stories with a single stair. And countries, you can see in this chart, most countries allow taller single stair buildings, but most of them are mid-rise height. They're allowed at a height that corresponds with ladder reach, of the ladders reaching from fire trucks and fire apparatus. But there's a couple cities in the US that allow taller single stair buildings, namely Seattle, New York City, and Honolulu. Their heights that they allow in those cities aligns with common heights that are allowed already around the globe. Next slide, please. So even though the US is very conservative in its approach to allowing single stair buildings, and it's very restrictive on the heights that are allowed, The fire safety numbers don't show that the US is more safe than other countries or exemplary as far as fire safety. We're actually right in the middle of the pack as far as fire safety numbers in the US. And most countries that are safer than the US allow taller single stair buildings. It's also notable that the safest country on this list, Switzerland, allows single stair buildings to an unlimited height. So they build high-rise single stair buildings in Switzerland that only use a single stair and use layers of safety provisions, safety measures to provide a safe exiting condition. Next slide, please. So some of the strategies that different jurisdictions use for single stair housing, where it's used, is that they require short distances from units to exit stairs. So very short exiting distances. For example, in Seattle, the maximum corridor length you can have from a stair door to a unit door is 20 feet. Seattle also restricts the number of units per floor to 4 units. New York City limits the square footage on a floor. So it's not as simple as simply just removing the second means of egress. Jurisdictions that use single stair egress do it by combining the single stair with multiple layers of fire safety. So it's important to note that it's not a double-loaded corridor building where you pull out a stair and then you're just left with a long dead-end corridor. The goal is to create a compact footprint with a very short exit time that allows people to quickly, safely get out of the building. Next slide, please. And when talking about fire safety as well, I know Mark's going to go into more detail. Another item to note is that Seattle's building code and cities that allow single stair in the US and most countries around the world, they allow buildings that are much different than tragedies that you've heard of, like the Grenfell Tower in London. Seattle's building code is tailored to buildings that are a maximum of 6 stories in height. And so buildings that would have a maximum of 20 units using the stair, that would require fire sprinklers, quick evacuation, and fire-resistant cladding. In contrast, the Grenfell Tower in London was a terrible tragedy, but it fundamentally is very different in that it had 24 stories, 120 units. It had no fire sprinklers, and residents were ordered to shelter in place for any fire or life safety events. And that's not the type of structure that's being talked about being allowed anywhere in the US right now, not even close to a project in that scale or that lenient in life safety standards. Next slide, please. So a lot of different states and cities have been discussing building code reform measures that would allow taller single stair buildings. Next slide, please. And this map tracks some of those cities and states. Includes Tennessee and the bill that was passed this year. It also includes other states that have passed legislation in the last 2 years. And each city, each state, each locality is kind of navigating the building code reform issue in a different way. Some states are establishing study groups that are going to dive into the issue and come back with recommendations to change state or local codes. Like I mentioned, Seattle, New York, and Honolulu all already allow taller single stair buildings. Vermont actually allows 4-story single stair buildings because they don't use the IBC for their egress requirements. Vermont actually uses NFPA 101, which has a different single stair requirement and allows 4-story single stair housing. So if you visit like Burlington, you can see they've built 4-story single stair projects in that city. Next slide, please. So next we'll jump into Seattle and Seattle's building code, and what they've evolved to allow in the city that has allowed this type of housing that has been high quality, allowed for greater infill development and more housing types in the city, and provided a lot of great housing options. Next slide, please. So next, I'll kick it over to Mark, and we can start diving into what the building code approach looks like in a city that has used single stair development for decades, and how officials have approached the issue in that city.
Thanks, John. Just wait and see if I have control of the slides. So we get a lot of questions here in Seattle about how we came to the decision to introduce single stair residential construction. So I'm going to try to cover most of the common questions today. Beginning with, when did the provisions come into the code? Why did we adopt them? I think we'll go through some examples later that Trish and Ashley will cover that show some good examples of them. We don't really have a count of how many single stair buildings exist in Seattle, but we can show you some really good examples of buildings that have been built using these provisions. I'll talk briefly about respond briefly to the question, what problems, if any, have we experienced from the single stair exceptions? And then the last thing I want to talk about, because the part that I left out of my bio, is I've spent 15 years as a fire chief as well. So I have fairly considerable experience in the fire service side of this. And the fire service is one of the principal opponents nationally to the expansion of single stair requirements. And I want to talk a little bit about how we might respond to some of the criticisms and concerns that have been raised by firefighters. So the first introduction of single stair provisions in Seattle occurred in the 1977 edition of the code, and appears to have reflected recommendations of a mayoral task force that was convened in 1973 to review the Uniform Building Code. And as best we can tell, the introduction of these provisions was an attempt to reflect existing local conditions that were already allowed under previous editions of the Seattle Building Code. So prior to 1977, Seattle, like many cities, wrote its own code and kind of picked and chose provisions from other codes to develop their own code. And like the model codes themselves, most code requirements reflect successful local models, something that was tried and tested someplace before it was adopted as a national model. So when the city adopted the Uniform Building Code, they simply made allowances for a condition that was already recognized as an acceptable and safe condition. So it was a prescriptively allowable provision rather than an exception to the two-stair requirement. As the current building official in Seattle is remarked that the driver of these changes was happening at the time, and concerned that the building code was constraining that development. As Sean said, Seattle, like many other urban centers, metropolitan centers in the United States, has traditionally had relatively small single-family lot sizes, and much of our original subdivision of the city reflected an expectation that most of our residential construction would be detached single-family dwellings. As a consequence, we have development sites that are relatively difficult to build multifamily housing on unless you unlock the potential of creative design solutions such as point access blocks. And this is not a new condition. I think there's been some suggestion that this is really purely a response to the current housing crisis that many cities around the globe are facing, many countries around the globe are facing. But these development pressures have existed for decades and were widely recognized here in Seattle back in the 1970s, if not sooner than that. So in the current edition of the Seattle Building Code, which is locally adopted and amended version of the 2018 International Building Code, the provisions in that code for single exit buildings, which are found in 1006.3.3, are amended by the local requirements. So instead of having a prescriptive allowance for this, we now have an exception. And this is simply an artifact of the way that the code has evolved over time. In the original code provisions, we told you you can have single exit buildings. Here's what they look like. The way the code has evolved and been reformatted over time, we have a provision that says you have to have 2 exits, except, hey, here's when you can have single exits. And then we've further amended that to allow a specific situation for taller single exit buildings than the base code allows. As you can see, there are quite a number of conditions attached to that permission. And I'm going to go through these in a little bit more succinct fashion in the following slides, because I think the way we've adopted them as a code is a little bit verbose. So I'm going to regroup them a little bit and kind of point out which ones are unique to this condition and which ones are really already attached to residential development in the main. So single exit or single stair is allowed in group R2 occupancies. And we have a confusing provision that says that a single stair may only serve 5 floors. Well, that's 5 floors above grade. So the grade floor is assumed not to require the stair as a means of egress. So that's your 6th floor. So it's 5 floors above the level of exit discharge. And there is a prohibition on using the building as a boarding or rooming house. The assumption here is that you want an occupancy that's stable, where the occupants are generally familiar with the means of egress, where the number of occupants is going to be limited by the number of people who will typically occupy a dwelling unit, rather than boarding houses and rooming houses, which typically have a much higher occupant density and may be more transient. As Sean already mentioned, we limit the number of dwelling units per floor to 4, but we also limit the floor area to 2,500 square feet per floor. So again, this recognizes that the principal development opportunity here is single-family dwelling sites, where we already have a fairly limited floor area ratio allowed on those sites. So this floor area and unit count is intended to complement the land use provisions in the zones where these types of buildings are common. We allow any type of construction that has a 1-hour fire resistance rating, which means that this type of building can be constructed of types 2A, 3A, type 4C, actually any type 4 construction, and type 5A construction. That means that combustible construction types are permitted. We don't restrict the construction of these buildings to fire resistive or non-combustible construction types. We simply require that there's a fire resistance rating. The 1-hour fire resistance rating also recognizes the requirements in section 420 of the building code, which call for a 1-hour separation between dwelling units. So again, this simply complements provisions that are already in the code to ensure that we're not adding to the fire containment problem by allowing types of construction that aren't fire resistant. We require automatic sprinklers in all Group R occupancies, except for detached single-family dwellings in Seattle. The difference here is that for a single exit building, we require you to use the NFPA 13 design method, not the 13R design method. The principal difference between the two standards is that NFPA 13 will require sprinklers in some combustible concealed spaces that would otherwise be exempt under NFPA 13R. And it changes the design basis from a design density of 0.05 gallons per minute per square foot over the most remote 4 sprinklers or the largest number in any single compartment to the NFPA 13 design method, which is 0.10 gallons per minute per square foot, so about twice as much, and the largest number of sprinklers in any single room, or 5 sprinklers in a corridor. Now, we don't see corridors in these buildings, so you don't get into 5 sprinklers. Now, this seems like a bigger difference in water supply than it might otherwise turn out to be. But when you start looking at the floor plans of these units, most of these systems achieve 0.1, even if you had tried to design to 13R, you would have ended up with a density that's more like the NFPA 13 provisions anyway. The other difference between NFPA 13R and NFPA 13 is the minimum required duration of water supply. And in urban areas with municipal water supplies, that really isn't a consideration. NFPA 13R only requires a water supply with a 30-minute duration or capacity, and NFPA 13 for light hazard requires a 60-minute duration. So, this NFPA 13 requirement did not exist in 1977 when Seattle first adopted this, and neither did smoke alarms. So we were allowing single stair buildings from 1977 onward until we adopted mandatory Group R sprinkler requirements with the 2009 edition of the code to be non-sprinklered. Bear in mind that in 1977, we had only just begun to introduce smoke alarms. And at the time, they were only 110-volt smoke alarms. They had to be plugged in or hardwired. And what we're seeing over the time since we've made the sprinkler requirements universal and since smoke alarms have become universal is that we've all but eliminated fire deaths in sprinkler protected properties. About the only time we see a fire death in a sprinkler protected property is when the individual who is severely injured or dies is intimate with the fire ignition scenario. In other words, they ignite their clothing or ignite their bedding. And sprinklers are still quite effective in those fires in protecting others, and sometimes even effective in protecting the person involved in fire ignition. We do require that the sprinklers used on these systems are residential sprinklers. There's a difference between sprinklers that are listed for residential use and sprinklers that are used in other occupancies. Primary difference here is that residential sprinklers have a flatter discharge pattern, so they discharge water higher on the adjacent walls in the rooms that they're installed in. That recognizes that in residential construction, residential occupancies, we tend to have a different distribution of fuel loads than we do in commercial occupancies. We also restrict the number of single exit buildings or point access blocks allowed on any single parcel. We do have some very deep parcels that aren't very wide, and we limit the number of point access blocks on any parcel to 2. That hasn't turned out to be much of a practical limitation, but that was a concession that was made to complement, again, the land use code to make sure that the 2 pieces of legislation were aligned. And then finally, we have a requirement when we provide a single stairway that's interior to the building, we require it to be pressurized to prevent the ingress or migration of smoke into the stair, or you have to provide an exterior exit stairway. We've got a pretty even mix of the 2 design methods. Our weather here is generally fairly temperate, albeit a little wet for some people, but exterior exit stairways eliminate the need for the pressurized stair. Now, the other provisions that kick in here, as Sean mentioned already, are a limited travel distance. We restrict the travel distance in point access blocks to 125 feet overall, and that includes the travel distance using the stair. We restrict the exit access from any dwelling unit to the interior of the staircase to 20 feet. What's important about this is essentially a retreat to the provisions that were found in the earliest versions of the National Building Code, published by the National Board of Fire Underwriters, which became the basis for model codes. This particular requirement actually resets things for residential occupancies and doesn't apply in other buildings. So I think this is a really important thing to note that distinguishes point access blocks. We allow the dwelling units to open directly onto exterior stairs. We require a very small corridor between the dwelling unit entrances and the stairs and buildings with interior stairs. And really that's to provide a vestibule to balance the pressurized stair at the door where we have an interior stair with pressurization. At the exit discharge, we have some restrictions on courts. Basically, that's to protect people from the exit discharge to the public way to make sure that they're not passing by exterior openings that might allow fire to vent from a dwelling unit and impact their ability to reach the public way. Courts that have alternate routes don't have to meet these limitations. Dwelling units are not allowed to discharge through other occupancies. As Sean noted, one of the things that's really attractive about point access blocks, especially in terms of introducing missing middle housing, is the ability to not only increase dwelling unit density, to increase walkability and to provide opportunities for street level retail. We found that many of these buildings actually have active uses on the ground floor. And those active uses are generally light hazard or low hazard commercial activities. They may be offices, they may be studios of various types, but they could be small retail shops, barber shops, nail salons, all kinds of things. But this creates opportunities for active street level uses. And then finally, we have the same limitation that we have in the egress requirements generally, not to have unprotected openings within 10 feet of an unprotected stair. And the idea there again is to prevent people from having to pass by an opening to reach the public way. Now, elevators have become a recent topic of some concern. There are provisions in the single stair exception that recognize that these buildings may have elevators. Elevators are not required, but where they have elevators, they need to have a separated lobby. We have another special amendment in Seattle that requires elevator hoistway opening protection. And that provision provides 4 options in most buildings, but for point access blocks, we require either a separated lobby or shaft pressurization. So 2 of the options that would otherwise be available to buildings with requirement for elevator hoistway opening protection are eliminated for point access blocks in favor of these 2 preferred alternatives. Turns out that in most cases, people use the separated lobby because the corridor can serve as a lobby, and that provides, again, for a fairly efficient use of space. Recently, I've had a lot of questions about whether or not we need elevators in these buildings at all, and I've had to respond that no, that's not the case, the way the accessibility provisions work, especially when we have a limited number of dwelling units. We can meet the requirements, and generally most of these buildings meet all of their requirements for type A units on the ground floor. If they have type A units on floors above the level of exit discharge, of course, they need to have an elevator to serve occupants in those areas, and then the accessible route provisions in 1009 kick in. In general, where we have requirements for type B accessible units, stairs may serve as an accessible means of egress, and in a sprinklered building, we don't need to provide an area of refuge or an area of evacuation assistance. So
what were you saying?
It's still pretty feasible. Pardon? Was there a question there?
You can go ahead, Mark. I think it was an accident.
Okay. So here are some other requirements that are applicable to point access blocks, the same as they'd be applicable to other residential buildings. As soon as we hit the 4th level, we need to have a standpipe. We need to have a manual fire alarm system if we have more than 16 dwelling units, or we have floors, occupied floors, 3 or more stories above the level of exit discharge. But again, if it's a fully sprinklered building, all we're really doing is providing occupant notification, and the automatic sprinkler system serves as the means of initiating the evacuation alarm. So Again, we're putting an awful lot of reliance on the sprinkler system, but that's well warranted by the fire data. As with other buildings that require sprinkler systems, the sprinkler system monitoring panel or fire alarm system needs to be monitored off-site by an approved supervising station. The purpose of the supervising station is to notify the fire department automatically, so we're not reliant or dependent upon a 911 call. So how safe is it? Well, in the United States, we have about 140 million housing units. About 32 million of those are multifamily dwellings, compared to about 90 million single-family dwellings. The death rate in single-family dwellings is much higher than it is in multifamily dwellings. And so is the fire incidence rate. Turns out that in multifamily dwellings, we have fewer fires and fewer fire deaths, which suggests that creating more opportunities for multifamily housing is actually good for cities and good for fire safety. When we look at fires in residential occupancies, 50% of the fires that kill people start in bedrooms or living areas. And generally, those fires are confined to the room of origin. So dwelling units only have to have one means of egress, one escape path. So it's not surprising that most of the deaths occur in the dwelling units and do not impact people in adjacent dwelling units. It's probably important to note, and this is something that's come up in code hearings on single exit provisions, questions about whether or not single exit buildings provide adequate accommodation for people who are going to be aging in place or may develop disabilities. We do know that about 18% of residential fire deaths in the United States involve people with disabilities. But again, those residential deaths almost all occur in non-sprinkler protected properties. When we look at fire causes, most of the fires that we experience in residential occupancies are cooking fires, but they actually account for a relatively small number of fire deaths. It's other unintentional causes that we have to worry about because they cause a lot more fires and a lot more fire deaths. And again, our focus when it comes to fire prevention and fire safety has been on trying to address those causes with fire safety interventions like smoke alarms and automatic sprinklers. Intentional fires, which has become a recent question in Canada regarding single exit buildings, has been, what about fires that are set in the means of egress? Currently, U.S. fire statistics suggest that about 8% of fires in residential dwellings are intentionally set, and this includes in all locations, not just means of egress, and that they produce about 15% of fire deaths. The Canadian statistics suggested about 6% of all fires occur in corridors or in stairways, and this includes double-loaded corridors. But in sprinkler-protected buildings, there are no recorded fire deaths. So again, Seattle has some limits on the distance to the entrance to the exit from the dwelling unit. So most of the travel distance, most of the problem that we have to worry about is still in the dwelling unit where it's always been. And that's been true with double-loaded corridors and 2 exits, the same as it's true with single exits. So the provision of a second exit beyond the dwelling unit does not significantly contribute to occupant safety, because occupants are generally not reliant on that second exit stairway if the fire is in their dwelling unit. The whole deal here is protecting people in the dwelling unit where the fire starts. I think it's time for me to turn over to the next presenter, who will talk a little bit more about where point access blocks exist.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much, Mark. So if you have ever visited Seattle, you have likely seen single stair buildings because, as you can see from this map, they're everywhere. As part of our research at SAR, we've explored Seattle extensively to find these projects, and they're scattered all around the city, particularly in neighborhoods permitting construction over 3 stories. We'll show you some waterfront condos, all the way to student housing, everything in between. And you will see a sample of these point access blocks in Seattle, organized from the smallest to largest in terms of number of units. As you can see here, oh, there we go. As you can see here, the building is on the left, and then there's a detailed floor plan on the right with the site size. And this one in particular is a tiny lot. It's only 2,600 square feet, but it has 4 units. And each of these units are full floor, so cross ventilation and daylight is really prevalent. This project has 6 units, and it's not all 1 bed or studios. We also have 2 beds and a 3-bedroom unit in this building, which is great for families who are usually left out of apartment buildings. You might recognize this project by Miller Hull. It's award-winning. It's really well designed. It's also on a tiny lot, only 2,800 square feet. It's 6 stories, and all the units are full depth, so cross ventilation is really easy, and daylight is really prevalent as well. And also, this is a mixed use project, so there is a hair salon on the first floor. This project was actually replaced a single family home with 8 2-bedroom units. So this is another project where a small family could live, or someone with roommates, and the scale fits in really well in its surrounding. It's also amazing to see how many extra units you can get on a single family lot size. This is a condo project. It's the tallest of the ones we're showing. Most of the units are full floor. The bottom units are split into 2. Even those have cross ventilation, as we've talked about. The neighbors also, you can see it's single family neighbor and then a 5/1 apartment building. So it really does fit well into its context. This is a really interesting project. If you can see in the front, this site preserved a 100-year-old family home and added 10 units on that same property. You can see in the plan, the stair divides the units, and so none of the units have shared walls, and you still get that cross ventilation because they take up the entire width of the building. This is a condo building. It's mixed use. There are several businesses on the ground floor, including a really great cafe. Above the units are full depth. You can see here the living areas face the busier street, and the bedrooms are facing the quieter back of the building. And so it's just really well designed for the tenants. Here's another project by Build. This firm initially did a lot of single family homes, and so as their firm grew, they were able to do some of these larger single stair projects to grow their business, which is way easier than jumping to a huge multifamily project. This is a 5-story building with a basement. It's actually a Habitat for Humanity project that added 13 units for ownership, and it's been so successful that Habitat is already constructing another single stair in the same neighborhood within Seattle. And so this is maybe something that could happen in some of your cities as well. It's a really unique approach for Habitat. This is a super narrow lot. It's only 35 feet wide, but it adds 20 units of housing, particularly student housing for this one. This is in the Seattle U district near the University of Washington. And similarly, this is another really narrow lot, 35 feet wide. You can see right next to it, the single family the single family house is on a similar size lot. And the next one on the other side, there are apartments. So it does kind of fit into the context really well. So this is a study that we did in Denver to see what it would look like to take some of those Seattle precedents and put them on underutilized lots in our city for study purposes. And so this shows how 100 units could be built on these lots in Denver. And that's not even considering the number of beds. You can see that the finer grained scale of these buildings fits in really well with the neighborhood fabric. They just make sense. They don't really stand out as something that looks foreign. Some of these projects are on parking lots, vacant lots, infill. Some are next to existing structures. And so it's just a totally different way to think about infill. And it might be a great way to look at these types of buildings in Tennessee. So I'll hand it off to Trisha now to talk more about the legislation that was passed.
Great, thank you. Thank you for all the information and the presentations that help hopefully make this a really understandable, quick few slides that explain the single stair legislation that passed at the state of Tennessee and awaits kind of local adoption. So the reform legislation next is described here. So the six-story single stair vertical access point access blocks examples that are in Seattle, and several of these examples that we've been going through definitely inform what is described in our own legislation that was adopted. So the reform here, PC 820, is written such that it shall not prohibit less than 6 stories of group R2 occupancy as defined in the building code adopted by the Department of Commerce and Insurance Division of Fire Prevention to be served by a single exit if item 1, the building has not more than 6 stories above the grade plane. 2, if the building does not contain more than 4 dwelling units on any floor. Next. 3, if an exterior stairway or an interior exit stairway is provided. 4, if a corridor separates each dwelling unit, entry or exit door from the door to an interior exit stairway, including any related exit passageway on each floor, and the dwelling unit doors do not open directly into an interior exit stairway, but they may open directly into an exterior stairway. And if there is no more than 20 feet of travel to the exit stairway from the entry exit door of any dwelling unit. Next. If travel distance measured in accordance with the building code adopted by the Department of Commerce and Insurance Division of Fire Prevention does not exceed 125 feet, and if other occupancies in the same building do not have access to the group R2 occupancy portion of the building or with the single exit stairway. For purposes of this subdivision, parking garages and occupied roofs accessory to the group R2 occupancy may have access to the exit stairway. And 8, if the exit serving the group R2 occupancy does not discharge through any other occupancy, including an accessory parking garage. And next, if there are no openings within 10 feet of unprotected openings into the stairway other than required exit doors having a 1-hour fire resistive rating. Secondly, a local government may adopt the exceptions set out in this subdivision. And if by resolution or ordinance and the exception becomes operative on the date of adoption of the resolution or ordinance. So hence really thinking about, as we've heard from our speakers, lots of information that help understand the relationship to building code issues, between building code issues and some of the land use issues that are being addressed in thinking about urban infill housing and small developments. Next. And I'm going to hand off to Matt Lyle.
Thanks, Trisha. And thank you so much to our speakers today. I know if you've got questions and things like that as we are approaching the Q&A session, Ashley will kind of help moderate the Q&A session, but feel free to start parking some of those questions if you have them into the chat. That would kind of help us get ahead of that. So next steps and resources. So I think it's really critical to understand that what passed at state level is not a mandate that all local authorities having jurisdiction have to adopt this. It is an opt-in. what it does is it opens the pathway to local municipalities who want to amend their adoptions of the IBC to now accept the provisions as Trisha just read them, which mimic a lot. They look very similar to what has been adopted in Seattle since the 70s. And so I'm really very thankful for Mark being here, to kind of help facilitate some of the questions that from a life safety or even a response from the firefighting side may help us kind of walk through. I think we have a different landscape. Sean and Casey are coming from Colorado, where they've been advocating. The state level AIA has been in full support of their efforts, and they have been advocating for several years to try to move this into their state statute. We have a little bit of a different thing here in the state where we weren't really sure what this was, and then it passed. So now I think where we are, we're really hoping that this educational session today will equip our practitioners to now begin the conversations within your local communities about what do the AHJs feel comfortable with? What do we as architects feel comfortable advocating on behalf of? I think the housing affordability conversation and the housing crisis is a national and global crisis, but the state of Tennessee is experiencing it in a way that a lot of the country is not. We have a mass in-migration that's happening all across our state. And as we're wrestling with zoning ordinances and building codes, I think this is not a panacea by any stretch. I don't think anybody's espousing this to be, a silver bullet to the housing crisis that's occurring. But every little piece of resourcing that we can put into our toolbox to help in some way or shape address. One of my other roles outside of AIA is as the vice chair of the board for an affordable housing development nonprofit. I spend a lot of time looking at pro formas that have to do with housing construction. And I can tell you that the floor plate efficiency ratio of single stair allows basically one more unit per floor for the exact same area of floor plate. And that unit makes a big difference on your pro forma. From the AIA of Tennessee's resourcing standpoint, I think what we are envisioning and hoping for will happen as we move forward is that we will have an open conversation across the state about who is proposing what, and how can we come together and help our local practitioners be the on the ground in those conversations where experts. We want to be able to give our local practitioners the information necessary to continue to be that trusted resource for our elected officials as well as our authorities having jurisdiction. So as we said earlier, I'm the president of the state's component. But when you look at your local component, for West Tennessee, you've got Jason Weeks, in Middle Tennessee, Nick Dryden, in the Chattanooga area, Alex Ryland, and in East Tennessee, Megan Chafin. Each one of our local components has members who are very knowledgeable in housing construction and affordable housing. We have government relations task forces, not only the state level GR committee, but the local GR committees. This is an opportunity, I think, for us to be doing a really good job of knowledge sharing across the state. Next slide, Ashley. So just a couple of things to consider. I think these are probably more like AIA Tennessee considerations as we are starting to facilitate some of these next step conversations of getting your local municipalities and your local city councils and your local fire marshals on board with this. Again, consider how many irregular and odd lots there are within our metropolitan areas that could be unlocked for development potential. I think it would be really beneficial to, if you look at the examples that Casey was showing earlier, a lot of those are 4-story and 5-story. There was only one 6-story. But it would be really helpful to start to showcase some of these precedents of, noting the number of height and the number of stories. The maximum square footage per floor plate is a really key piece of this. Again, there's 4 units that are going around that single access block. So starting to show how, again, the difference between single loaded, double loaded, and single access block. I think that diagram that Sean showed at the beginning of his presentation of showing, a double loaded scenario with 7 bedrooms and the amount of floor plan efficiency we can get out of a single access block, still getting 7 bedrooms, each block getting each bedroom getting cross ventilation, each unit having public and privacy. I think there are some really great pieces from both, leveraging difficult to use property, but as well as creating we have this charge for health, safety, and welfare. Sometimes it's really difficult to talk about health and welfare. The safety piece is oftentimes a lot easier to talk about, but thinking about natural light and cross ventilation that this type of development pattern brings in are really vital pieces. And then I think considering the construction types that we are using, again, right now, the way that the state statute is written is not restricting to non-combustible or combustible construction type. I think showing precedents and having conversations about success within places across the country and across the world, like Seattle, where they're not limiting necessarily the construction types. I think that may be a good one of our suggestions as we start to facilitate some of these conversations. And with that, I think. Yes, I did want to turn it over. There's 2 really interesting things going on, both that SAR is doing, as well as there's a local design competition that I want to turn it back over to Sean real quick to talk about their design competition that they're hosting right now.
Oh, thanks, Matt. Yeah, just real quick for anyone that's interested in missing middle housing. SAR wanted to run with the neighborhood study that Casey showed earlier and elevate the conversation on that neighborhood study. And so we've worked with local sponsors in Denver, and next week we're kicking off a housing competition that's open to anybody. And it's all about exploring the housing options that are unlocked through single stair code reform. So feel free to reach out to me if you're interested or know anyone that would be interested. We're hoping that we can get some students to enter and engaged in the housing conversation. We'd love to have firms participate as well. And there's a $20,000 prize pot that'll be available. So feel free to reach out if you're interested in more info.
Hey everyone, this is Cameron Boland with AIA East Tennessee. I'm an architect in East Tennessee and also president-elect for AIA East Tennessee. We're currently hosting Housing East Tennessee 2024 ADU Design Competition. Another piece in the puzzle of providing housing options and density options for our area. This is currently allowed by right in the city of Knoxville and is a deployable, accessible now version to get housing density and affordability options going. It's open to all, free to enter, and more information can be found at the QR code at the top right or visiting AIAEastTennessee.org. It has more information on the competition as well. Entries and submissions are open till August 23rd, and the finalists will be announced and displayed at our October 3rd Design Awards Gala for everyone to review the projects and learn about them more. So we hope to hear from others, and if you have any questions, you can reach out to me specifically at cbolin@mhminc.com.
Could we scan that QR code?
Yep, if you scan it, it'll take you to the submission registration website.
Awesome. Thanks, Cameron. And with that, I think turn it over to Ashley for moderating of the questions and the answers.
Sorry, I just stopped my screen share and my screen just changed on me. So here it is. Okay, so I'm going to go in order of the questions. And we have a question. What does the path to local adoption look like? Matt, I think you might be able to take that one.
Sure. Yeah. And again, I think it's worth noting that the bill at the Tennessee state level is not necessarily the manuscript for it's not. I don't think the intention is that you just necessarily take what was passed at the state and copy and paste it to your municipality, although that certainly could be the case. But I think the path to local adoption will, if you look within the bill, it will have to be adopted as a local ordinance. So the local municipality will have to vote to amend their version of the building code. And that will have to occur by a council resolution. So, and I think there's some bit of question about for municipalities that defer their administration of building code to the state fire marshal. There are the exempt jurisdictions around the state. There is still a little bit of an active conversation going on within the state fire marshal's office, and AIA Tennessee, and our group is in good conversation regarding that piece. That is not a clear answer on that part. So if anybody was thinking, oh, I'm going to write that in, there's not an answer to that piece yet. But for your local municipality, that looks like the development community, the architects and engineers, and the local authorities having jurisdiction, having conversations to get to a place where the local city council can adopt an amended version, can put an ordinance through, and with a majority vote of your local council to then utilize the amendments under the IBC. I don't know, Mark, if you have any kind of further expert insight into the amendments of your building codes.
Nothing spectacular to offer in terms of that. There are two current proposals in the IBC means of egress code development process, E24 and E25. They were both recommended for denial at the first code action hearing in March, and there's a second round of hearings that will be held in Long Beach in October, where additional consideration will be given to both proposals. Stephen Smith from the Center for Building in North America is the proponent of both proposals, and they mimic various aspects of the Seattle provisions. Most of the states that have adopted legislation around the point access block or single stair have taken a similar approach to Tennessee in terms of offering it as an option for local amendment. Keep in mind that about a third of the states are permissive states where there either isn't a statewide building code or there's a state building code, but it's not mandatory that municipalities or counties adopt it. About a third have a mandatory state minimum that allows for some form of local adoption or amendment. And then about a third are what we call mini-max states, which prohibit various forms of local amendment. And then there's some scattering in between. So all of the states that have currently adopted a single stair provision are either state minimum permissive states or state minimum with a local adoption, local amendment provision. We don't see, Oregon's the only mini-max state on the list, and it's not yet clear how they're going to implement.
Thank you, Matt and Mark. The next question is, so there is no stair pressurization requirement for the stairwells in the Tennessee adopted legislation. Tricia or Matt, can anyone answer that one for me?
Well, so the IBC has stair pressurization requirements within the code language, and so I think that was where why it wasn't in the version that we saw in the state of Tennessee.
Amy, this one might be for you. Has Metro Davidson adopted this?
There was a bill earlier this year in Metro Nashville. It has since been withdrawn because the state also passed their bill. And there is another one that is in the works right now. And I'm sure it's going to take into consideration all the great information from today.
Ashley, can I come back to add to Matt's observation with stair
Sure.
pressurization? In the base code currently, we only kick in stair pressurization for high-rise buildings under section 403 and in certain 510 buildings, certain podium buildings under section 510. Most mid-rise buildings don't have to have stair pressurization that complies with section 90920. And that's one of the things that was added over time to the Seattle provisions. As I tried to cover, in 1977, none of those provisions existed. So, instead of taking things away or, reducing redundancy in 1977, we've actually added layers of protection over time to the Seattle provisions. So one of the arguments that's being made by opponents to these provisions is that we're reducing the level of redundancy in buildings. Well, the fact is that we've added an awful lot of redundancy over the years, especially with the introduction in 2009 of automatic sprinklers. For my money, as an experienced fire officer, I can tell you that the stair pressurization doesn't get you much more than that little short stub of a corridor does. So that corridor with the interior stair provides a really neat little vestibule. And even without stair pressurization, we get an awful lot of containment. We don't see smoke migrating into that corridor in general, as long as the stair integrity is maintained. The only time we lose it is once firefighting begins. And by the time we've got fire service on the scene, we ought to have everybody out. If we don't, that'll be the fire service's first priority before they initiate standpipe operations that'll compromise the stair integrity.
Thank you, Mark. The next one, it sounds like this does not affect/omit requirements for elevators above 3 stories and 3,000 square foot per floor. Is this correct? I will take a volunteer, Matt or Tricia or.
I can jump in and say that, it's more focused in the way that Mark has described on how it's pertaining to the stair and the single point access block types of movement and egress and such. So it's not related to that.
Mark Young had a question, and I noticed that the other Mark answered it in the chat, but I will go back up and ask what the fire department staffing level is in Seattle, Mark.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of discussion nationally that one of the reasons Seattle adopted these requirements and has kind of stuck with them is that they're relying a lot on fire service intervention, and they've got a great big fire department that's got a really good insurance rating and got great water supply. I've lived in Seattle and worked as a fire chief in 2 suburban jurisdictions here before I assumed my current role. And Seattle's fire department's good. No question, no ding against the Seattle Fire Department, but it's not special in any particular way. And there's not really any evidence in historical record that Seattle's decision to implement point access block provisions was based on an assumption that the fire service here had any particularly special or extraordinary capability when it came to firefighting and rescue operations. So we have 33 engine companies protecting a 91 square mile area. They're supplemented with 12 ladder companies. We maintain a 4 firefighter staffing. That's not untypical of other major metropolitan areas. I know some rural and suburban areas have lower staffing. Our response times are pretty average compared to the national average overall and to national standards. We do make most of our responses in less than 6 minutes from time of receipt to time of arrival in about 95% of the cases. So, we're not really extraordinary in that regard. I'll note that when I worked for the building code groups back in the 90s, when we were consolidating the model codes, one of the projects we took on was to develop the ICC performance code for buildings and facilities. And one of the big discussions we had was about how to deconstruct the prescriptive requirements into performance provisions. And one of the questions we asked the committee, and we asked ourselves as staff, is it the intent of the building code to ever allow a building to be constructed where any occupant depends upon fire service intervention for their safety? And our answer was no. That the building code should assure the safety of all occupants and their ability to safely escape without the necessity of fire service intervention. Now, at the same time, we have many provisions in the code that are intended to facilitate safe firefighting and rescue operations. But there's no assumption that we should ever allow an occupant to occupy a building with an assumption that their safety can only be provided by fire service response. And there was never an assumption here in Seattle that reducing provisions to allow single stairs as opposed to 2 was a reflection on a willingness to accept fire service rescue as an alternative to second exit.
Thank you, Mark. I know we're running up against our time of 12:30 for an hour and a half, which has gone by extremely fast today for this session. So I'm just scanning it. Thomas, we, AIA, we have a task force group that have been focused on this legislation once we learned it was being introduced and taking a hard look at it. And so we can pull that group together and talk about pulling to provide to local officials, mayors, and fire marshals. And we really appreciate all the local officials that were or are participating on today's informational webinar. That's their first step, is to try to learn more about single stair design and then how we can work together and collaborate. So we will work on that and get our members something. I'm just scrolling real quick. Is there a bill number in addition to the public chapter number that the legislation can be accessed? So yes, the public chapter is now the official legislation versus the bill number. If you looked up the bill number, there might be some amendments to it and not really getting to see the actual language. So we will be able to provide that, Aaron, to you. We also have a legislative overview that has the resources available, but we will get this to you after the session ends and as a recap within the next day or so. Kevin has a question about what about elevator shaft pressurization or smoke curtains at the elevator doors where opening onto rated corridors, since elevator lobby could also be considered a fire rated corridor.
So as I mentioned in my piece, Seattle requires elevator hoistway opening protection either in the form of hoistway pressurization or a lobby. In buildings other than single stair buildings, we do allow the curtains over the hoistway opening or a self-closing door over the hoistway opening. Those two options are not recognized for use in single stair buildings. So you either provide a rated lobby, which can still be a corridor, or you provide hoistway pressurization, but we don't require a separate lobby from the corridor.
I think that's it. Since we're running up against time, I'm going to turn it back over to AIA Tennessee's President Matt Lyle for some closing remarks. And just want to thank you for your time.
Thanks, Ashley. Yeah, and I just want to say a big thanks to Amy Harden, who put together our whole. She coalesced everybody, herded the cats, and put this presentation together for us today. Big thank you to Amy, and also a big thank you to our presenters. Again, we're folks from all around the country coming together today to focus on this set of conversations. This is certainly not the last conversation about this. This is sort of intended to be one of the first for us as the state of Tennessee architects as an information session. Look for, this was recorded today, so we will be sending out and posting this on AIA Tennessee's website. And we are trying to make this the resourcing that's available here and our presenters as open as possible to help us all get to a place where we feel comfortable facilitating the conversations and helping our local communities make the decision whether they would like to move forward with some of this. I know that these conversations are already occurring around the state, so we want to be trying to put this information out there so that we can be helping in whatever way our communities find best. And with that, let's say, well, thank you everybody for attending. Can't do this without everybody who attended. So good luck, have a great day, and we will see everybody in 3 weeks in Knoxville for the state conference, August 7th through 9th. If you're not registered, I know we love a good deadline, we architects. So if you're not registered, please do go ahead and do that, and we will see everybody in a couple weeks. Thanks, everybody.